welcome to Daily Debrief brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Swastika and let's get into the stories for today. We begin with Iran nuclear deal. Iran on Monday said that an agreement on the deal or the JCPOA is nowhere closer. It also reportedly blamed the US for the delay. More than one issue is still pending between Iran and the United States, said the Iranian Foreign Minister spokesman Saeed Khatibzadeh. He added that the United States is responsible for these delays because they're taking their time to give replies that would be suitable for Iran. Now, the talks to restore the deal began in April 2021. At various points of time, reports said a deal was close, but it hasn't happened yet. Now, to understand this, let's go over to Prashant and talk about this. Prashant, where is this deal stuck? Where is it stuck right now?
Right, Swastika. So, like you said, the negotiations began in April 2021. We've seen multiple rounds, close to 8 or 9 rounds. And more or less, it has boiled down to one or two or three key issues. And I think the most important one that a lot of experts are talking about is the fact that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the IRGC, one of the most important aspects of Iran's security establishment, that is still listed as a foreign terrorist organization by the United States. Now, Iran wants the US to withdraw this designation. Right. And the United States is unwilling to do so. Now, this has become one of the key block points. Of course, there are a couple of others as well. But this in some ways shows the kind of political, the problems right now with the deal per se. Because removing this tag is actually largely symbolic. And removing it is not going to change much on the ground per se, either in response to the IRGC's activities, which were anyway not blocked too much by this designation, or from the United States perspective. The only problem is that this is politically, very problematic for US President Joe Biden and his administration, especially with the midterm elections coming up, the fact that the Republicans are constantly accusing him of being soft generally on terrorism or whatever, extremism or whatever, the fact that the Israel lobby in the United States has so much power, all this together is, and of course the Democrats' own political compulsions and beliefs as well. So all this together is actually blocking that, and this kind of shows the logjam of the US political establishment as a whole, which is what has led us to the situation in the first place. We know that in 2018, Donald Trump and his close advisors together withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal. There was no reason to do that. It was a completely pointless withdrawal. We also know that in the aftermath, so many sanctions were imposed which were destined to destroy Iran, which were made to destroy Iran. On the other hand, nothing of that sort happened. Iran continued to survive. Iran continued to be a powerful country, which was bound to happen. And now, once Biden came to power, he could have immediately re-entered the deal, but nonetheless chose to keep negotiations going to try to get some kind of concessions from Iran, with the understanding that he could then say that, hey, I've got all these concessions in order to go back, so that he does not appear too moderate by US political standards. But the fact is that Iran does not have any reasons to give more concessions now, because Iran has already suffered so much. Iran's economy has definitely been affected by the fact that these sanctions were imposed in 2018. Internationally, it has faced a huge amount of pressure even to sell its own oil. It has really struggled. And only China has been one of the few countries which has continued to buy it. And every aspect of life was being sanctioned. Even during COVID-19, Iran suffered. So at this point, asking Iran for more concessions seems a bit of a, it's really asking them to bow down further, which really does not make sense. And the Iranian establishment also has taken a decision that, we can wear out these sanctions. We are holding the cards right now because Iran's nuclear activity is continued, and Iran has shown that it can weather these sanctions. So they are like, we don't want to give any more concessions either. So this is the broad situation right now, and this, like I said, the political bankruptcy of the United States is what is on display here, because otherwise this deal should have been done much, much earlier, and this is why it's still stuck.
In fact, another factor has developed in this period of time, the Ukraine war. How does that become a factor in this deal?
Right. So initially there were some, thoughts or ideas that because of the Ukraine war, because of the supply, the block of, or restrictions on Russian oil supply, or the fact that many countries would have wanted to skip Russian oil supply, the progress on the deal will be accelerated so that Iranian oil could replace or be brought into the market and sort of stabilize the situation. However, that's not exactly how it has panned out. Now, let's make it, this is also, Iran is losing out a bit here, because it still means that Iran cannot sell its oil as much as it wants to. There is probably far more of a market now than there was a year or two earlier, and this probably Iran could benefit much more out of it. So that's definitely one aspect. There was an attempt, there were also issues around where how Russia, the sanctions on Russia basically would impact the nuclear deal as well. But I don't think right now those are really the main issues that are really blocking it. And I think it is more the kind of pressure the Israel lobby has been applying, the right wing has been applying, and the Democrats' own, like I said, weakness / indecisiveness on this issue, which has rendered this deal. It's not dead, obviously. And despite the fact that the West has, European countries have been continuously giving warnings, saying it's too late, Iran will do this, Iran will do that, Iran will become a fully nuclear power. That's an attempt really to just flip the issue entirely and try to fix the responsibility in Iran, whereas we have to be clear where the responsibility is. But nonetheless, the fact remains that this is a bit of a loss for Iran. But other than that, is the war majorly affecting the nuclear deal? I don't think so. I think it's more of other sets of compulsions which are really working in the background in various ways as well. And I think, like I said earlier, the Iranians have taken a very concrete decision that enough is enough. We're not going to give in too much. We've already given in quite a bit. We're not going to give in. I think at least there are one or two of those Iranian earlier demands which they have basically walked back on, or they've maybe abandoned. For instance, the issue of the fact that the US has to give a written guarantee that no future administration will walk out of the deal. I don't think that might exactly happen. That's what the reports say. Iran might live with that. Iran might also not ask for reparations for the huge losses it has suffered since 2018. So all that, I think Iran has already given up. But I think on the IRGC itself is a factor that Iran seems very insistent on. Now there are talks of various compromise solutions where the IRGC itself might be taken out of the list, but one of its wings, the Al-Quds Force, might nonetheless remain on it, or certain individuals might remain on it while the organization comes out. So there's speculation around all it. None of it is really confirmed yet. But it is unfortunate that because ultimately, like we talked about often on the show, the people most affected by this are the people of Iran, who are continue to suffer the consequences of economic sanctions and the fact that there is no real logic for it at all. So that's where we are.
Well, thank you for those details, Prashant. Do stay with us for our next story as well. Amid an ongoing dispute with public sector labour unions over salary review, the Swaziland police once again began persecution on Mabongwa Dlamini, president of the Swaziland National Association of Teachers, the country's largest union. Now, this follows the government's dispute with public sector associations, a coalition of 4 unions of accountants, nurses, teachers, and public services and allied workers. Now, SNAT is the largest of them, representing around 14,000 of the estimated total of 16,000 teachers in the country. Now, to understand what's going on with these protests, Prashant, could you tell us what are the charges against this union leader, and if this is a targeted attack?
Right. So this is, in some sense, I think we need to understand this. One, of course, is the persecution of one union leader, the leader of the largest union in the country, like you said, but also the context of a larger systemic issue that is taking place with regards to the economy of the country itself, with regards to the kinds of demands that unions are putting forward. So there is both the issue of political repression, which is a big issue in Swaziland, and of the government's attempt to sort of deny the economic demands of public sector workers across the country. So both these aspects kind of converge in the issue of Dlamini, who is the president of this union, SNAT. So if you look at it, in fact, the charges against him are quite absurd. The fact that he tried to prevent an arrest, and I think this is regarding a case in 2020. And as he has pointed out while talking to People's Dispatch, the policemen who filed this charge against him of preventing the arrest were of a different department than the policemen, who were involved in it. So there was traffic police were involved, regular police were involved. So it's an absurd case. But more importantly, it's important to note that just a few days ago, his house was plastered with bullets because the police were trying to repress some protesters, and the protesters, passed by his house. They, jumped into his house to escape the police. The police started firing, and even when they left the house, the protesters left the house, the police kept firing, and his children were inside. So very dangerous situation in Swaziland. Just shows how random the violence has become in some senses, that anybody can be targeted in this sense, and especially clearly there seems to be also a very concerted attempt in this case of targeting a union leader. But that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is also professionally he's being targeted again for a most absurd charge. It seems he forgot to put a date on some kind of a timetable which teachers are supposed to fill, and he's being persecuted for that. Also, there's an attempt to sort of deny him his ability to teach. There's been earlier action. He's approached the court. Both these cases are going to be heard soon. So this is one aspect of it. But as you said, there's a larger debate and discussion, a larger issue going on here, which is that thousands of workers of all the sectors you mentioned, they have been engaged in a struggle with the government because the government said that they would review their pay in the 2021-2022 financial year. And this is a very important issue to look at because the economic situation is extremely bad. There's a lot of, in terms of the salaries are really poor as far as many of these workers are concerned. But the government has been suggested that they'll give them a cost of living allowance, which is a very minor addition. And this is despite the fact that the same government is spending a huge amount of money on the luxuries of the king, Mswati III, who was Africa's last absolute monarch. So the unions are definitely very angry and there's this consistent action going on against them. So we see that over the past many years, this has been a consistent theme in Swaziland as well. The attempt by unionized employees to sort of push their very legitimate demands and the refusal by the government to concede. And once the issue reaches a particular momentum, where the workers take to the streets, for instance, then there is all-out repression. So Dlamini's case here, like I said, is a convergence between of these two aspects, the repression as well as the denial of economic demands. And I think this is just one aspect of a larger social crisis in Swaziland.
In fact, if you could tell us more about the larger social crisis.
Right, Swastika. So as we talked about very often on this show, Swaziland is it's a very small country, true, but it's also a very interesting country to note because we see a lot of forces which are in some ways unusual, but which are also in some ways very representative of the global picture. For instance, the fact that there is, on the one hand, its uniqueness comes from the fact that there is, say, a system where the absolute monarch has complete control over the country. The parliament is pretty much a rubber stamp. It's completely feudal in some senses. On the other hand, Swaziland is also facing a lot of the crises which its bigger neighbors, for instance, or many countries across the world are facing, which is what happens when extreme neoliberal policies are implemented, what happens when, say, the workers do not get their due rights, the kind of protests that take place. Swaziland also interesting because the amount of public anger, the public upsurge has been very, very strong. With demands for both democracy in the political and social sense, but also equal rights, proper rights and fundamental rights, and justice in an economic sense as well. So all these protests have been mounting considerably. Just recently in April, we saw that the students boycotted classes because after they are not given their allowances, which is a big issue for the students. Last year, we saw major protests breaking out across the country after one student was again murdered by the police. And then you saw that when the protests really gained strength, there was massive repression by the security forces. Close to 70 people were killed. Mswati even fled the country. So on the whole, I think you see a very tottering system as far as the political system is concerned right now. It's a big question that how long can Mswati and his regime continue to repress the people and continue to impose these kind of policies. And for the opposition forces also, it's an interesting moment because as the protests gain momentum, of course, it's not a matter of one day or 1 month or 6 months or whatever. It might take much longer time. But it does very clearly look like we are moving over time into a much more, say, decisive moment for the country because last year's protests were the first round which perhaps properly entered rural Swaziland as well, which is traditionally far more loyal to the monarchian systems. But this time what we're seeing is that as time passes, the country itself is undergoing a great deal of churning. And we are, like I said, we might probably reach a decisive moment soon, which gives the opposition, the communists are an important part of the opposition, a big opportunity, a big question in terms of what kind of country do they want to build, what kind of society do they want to build, and how do you destroy the vestiges of feudalism. So of course all that is in the future, but right now what we are seeing is on the one hand, there is hardly a section of society which is not protested. On the other hand, there is continuous repression. So these forces are continuously colliding. We need to see what happens.
Well, we'll keep an eye on that. Thank you for joining us with those details, Prashant. Aged care workers in Australia are preparing for massive industrial action. Thousands of workers in 5 major facilities across Australia have voted overwhelmingly in favour of industrial action, with votes from 3 more care facilities expected next week. The vote organised by the United Workers' Union is in response to a continuing crisis in the aged care sector. In Australia, the sector has been the hardest hit during the COVID-19 pandemic, contributing to a disproportionately large number of infections and deaths in an otherwise contained space. Now, to understand about this, let's go over to Anish. Anish, should we talk about what the industrial action is all about?
Yes, Swastika. So the language that they used, which is industrial action, is very specific because it will include other actions apart from strikes. Now that includes not filing reports, not filing your progress in the facility, not presenting yourself as present on the day of your work, and so on and so forth. And also other forms of demonstrations, even show of solidarity by workers. We are looking at already 7,000 workers, and thousands of more are expected to participate in it. And this is important considering the fact that the aged care sector is, as you pointed out, very disproportionately affected by a crisis that has been ongoing since the outset of the pandemic. In 2020 alone, we had a situation where about at one point there were like an entire month where nearly half of the deaths reported in the country were from aged care facilities. And so that shows the amount of negligence that the government, not only the federal government, but also state governments have shown towards the aged care sector. And it actually also shows the kind of understaffing that has happened for so long. So this is a system-wide issue. Obviously, we have the healthcare sector as a whole affected by the conservative government, the coalition government's austerity measures, neoliberal policies, where they're trying to bring down regulations on labor codes. They're trying to not give in to wage hike demands and other union demands. But this is something that is far more pronounced in the aged care sector. Yeah.
So if we try to understand how there is a crisis in this sector, it has to do with the policies?
Yes, definitely the policies, and this is exactly why workers are trying to do it at this point in time. Because obviously the aged care crisis, when the deaths happen, comes into national spotlight, and everything just goes silent after that. We saw in January, as close as January, where you had about 650 deaths. That's around 27% of national death toll by the Omicron wave being reported in this one single sector, which barely has less than a percentage of the nation's population. So we are talking about a disproportion of a magnitude that is huge. Yeah. And in this manner, the government has done barely anything, actually. They've sent the army during the crisis, obviously, during the Omicron wave, just deployed the army to assist the aged care sector workers, but they haven't done anything beyond that. They announced an $800 bonus for these workers, which 97% of them have not received, and more than three-quarters of them have reported that they have not even been informed if they're going to get this bonus. And the government is just passing the blame to some kind of bureaucratic logjam. We are also looking at demands for a fair contract not being met, demands for fair wage. We have to remember that the average wage of a aged care worker is barely above the minimum wage standards right now in Australia. It's around $22 per hour. The minimum wage stands at around $21 per hour. Okay. So it is barely above that. So we are talking about most of them living in very essential wages. And they are overworked, they are understaffed, they have to actually take on work that others do not. Obviously, there are no people to do it. We are also looking at anywhere between a fifth to a quarter of the shifts going completely vacant. So this actually affects care as a whole, and still nothing about it is being done. And we have to also remember that the care also extends to the general population, because it's not just the residents. Obviously, residents are an essential part of the aged care sector, but there's also aged care sector provides services that are essential to the larger senior citizen population, which is a large number in Australia. We have to remember it's an aging country, demographically speaking. So in that sense, it is it is going to be an absolutely essential issue in the upcoming election season, because we are also not seeing any better alternatives or policy decisions or even promises coming from the opposition. So it is something that really needs to be focused on, highlighted by anybody who really cares about the healthcare sector in that country.
Thank you for those details, Anish. And that's all that we have today. Thank you for watching Daily Debrief. Do come back tomorrow. Please visit www.peoplesdispatch.org and follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram.